Thank you, everyone, to being here. This is the first speaking event for young professionals. It's really a milestone for us. We're really happy to see you all here, see familiar faces and new faces, which is great also. What we're trying to do here for young professionals, just to have a little introduction for some of you who haven't heard about it, as an ERG employee resource group of Alcon, we have 3 pillars, and hopefully you feel somehow identified with one of them or all of them. The first one is provide guidance to young professionals. So what we're trying to do is help to that transition of the young talent to get into the professional world and actually use the knowledge of the experienced people already. And I would ask you, for managers and people who have been around in this business or in this professional world for a while, what would you like to tell to these young people, right? What would you tell to yourself if you were in your early careers, right? What advices, what kind of knowledge would be useful and would help you to have a better career overall? So that's what we're trying to do. We want to provide a platform to make that happen. And second, improve work environment in Alcon. We want to bring fun into Alcon. We want to actually get Alcon to the new trends and be part of that cultural change. And this is a perfect timing for that with this new Alcon. So we want to have a voice of that, right? I mean, and every one of you could have a vision of how you think Alcon be better at something, and every one of you had something to say, and it's meaningful and can be done. This is a perfect example of that. Today, this is started as an idea, and it's happening right now. Thanks to that idea, and thanks for speaking up, Hannah and Anna, and they actually organized it, and we are all here today for that. Third one is talent development, young talent development. So we actually want to provide tools and actually bring some potential training, bring speakers, and actually provide all other activities where knowledge is being transmitted to young professionals. So again, if you think this is something that you feel interested to be involved, and you think that you have something to provide, or you are interested to get something of this, please stay in touch, and for sure, be part of these young professionals. And the first question that people ask me is, who's young professional, right? What's the age? And my answer is not about age, it's about your attitude. It's about how you actually embrace change, how you actually feel committed to get things better, improve, and also how afraid are you to actually embrace it and speaking up. So if you feel that way, no matter if you're starting your career or you're being in this role for a while, it doesn't matter. You have something to provide for the company and for the young talent. So thank you all, and I'm gonna let Hannah to introduce our guest. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name's Hannah. Anna and I are on we plan a lot of the events for the young professionals, so you probably see my name on the social hour emails. That's me. Dr. Vroman will be joining us today. He was my professor, actually, in college, so it was one of these cool opportunities where we got to bridge the gap and kind of bring in our experience and bring it in to help other people. And Dr. Vroman is a communications professor at Texas Lutheran University. He has a background in doing talks like this over social media or professional development. So that's what he's here today, is to help us with our professional development. So without further ado, Dr. Vroman.
All right, so did you read it? What do you think happens next? You don't want me to tell you, do you? Well, that's kind of... All right, so you have microphones at your table, and they work like we're at the United Nations, and like I'm in charge of something, which is kind of cool. Or I think of The Rescuers, the old Disney movie. That's my Gen X timestamp. You know, I think little mice coming in and things like that. So you can say something. So what I'm interested in is you finishing the story for me. So somebody give me a hand and tell me what you think should happen in this story. Give me a 15-second version of what happens next. What would be cool? This is where you find out that already you didn't do the homework. Like it was right there for like 10 minutes. This is one page. I'm a college professor, it happens. Nobody wants to finish the story for me? What do you think should happen? Open the door, and then what happens? What does our adventurer meet inside the house? Eerie darkness. Good, good. And how does it end? I mean, we find something in the eerie darkness that comes after us, and what is our challenge? Got to escape. What kind of monsters are we going to find? A cat? An evil cat, or is it a fake out? Okay. All right.
Use your mics,
We're going to find
please.
vampires. We're going to find zombies. What are we going to find?
Use your mics, please.
Ooh, yeah. Use those mics. Come on, you guys. You can do it. Come on. I know it feels like weird. It feels like I don't know if I'm important enough for this mic. I'm sitting in front of the mic, and I'm a young professional, but I'm not allowed to use the mic because I wouldn't want to speak up in the presentation on interactivity. That would be bad. Nobody wants to know? What's inside? Vampires, zombies, werewolves? The Twilight Zone, unfortunate Southern stereotypes where they have chainsaws and stuff?
Excuse me. It could be a nice little bed and breakfast.
Oh, go the other way. I like the surprise. I didn't think of the bed and breakfast. A little sausage roll in the morning or something, you know. Maybe they have the dark roast that you can never get. Anything else? So I can finish it for you. You know, I could tell you how the story would end, but I actually like the bed and breakfast better. Every time I do something like this, I get a better answer than what I would have thought. And that's really where we're starting here in talking about this idea of adventure. And so I want to take some time with you today to talk about what we might learn from that in terms of building our presentations moving forward. So, all this interactivity, this book that you see is called The House of Hell, written in 1984. And this was very similar to a choose-your-own-adventure novel. Raise your hand if you read one of those. It's like old now, right? You know how that's like. You read, and then it's like, okay, if you go upstairs, turn to page 6, and you go downstairs, turn to page like 23, and then you keep moving around, and at a certain point, you end up with all your fingers in the book so that you can try to like backtrack when you die. Interactive book, right? You don't just read all the way through. This book was called a fighting fantasy novel, which was a little bit different. You actually had a character, and you rolled dice when you met the zombies. It was still like a choose-your-own-adventure, but it was like if you played Dungeons & Dragons but had no friends. I had a lot of these books, and so, you know, so this is so you think about that. This is 1984, and that's an old story, right? That's cliche. The dark and stormy night, man, that was cliche back in like 1765, the year after Walpole invented the Gothic genre with the Castle of Otranto. You know, this has been an old story forever. But still, you know, we want to know what it's going to do. We want to interact with it. We don't want the book to tell us what's going to happen, and that's 1984. Now think about everything that's happened in the last 35 years to make us want to interact more. And in 1984, the idea of reading a book from beginning to end seemed too oppressive. Too many choices taken away from us. Yet, if you go to South by Southwest, they have one element to it. How many have been to South by Southwest? Okay, good. You're cooler than the other. No, I'm just. You think you're cooler. That's what's important about South by Southwest. If you think you're amazing when you're finished, then it was amazing. And that's the essence of Austin, Texas. And so at South by Southwest, they have an entire track called South by Southwest Interactive, where the entire thing is about interactivity, designing interactive experiences, designing gaming, designing computer, simulations, designing all sorts of cool stuff that's all interactive. And this is what their PowerPoints look like. I don't know about you, but that feels really interactive to me. There's nothing like reading a PowerPoint full of bullets and stock photos that you desperately try to make sure you can find one that you can steal for free off the internet and have the little stock photo thing taken off the middle of the picture so nobody knows where you got it. Sounds fantastic, sounds great. And so if you go to South by Southwest Interactive, you will experience an awful lot of people like me standing in front of screens like this, talking at you for an hour, and then you go to lunch. Have like a brisket taco. Wait in line at Hopdoddy for 2 hours for some fries. So why is it that in 1984 we could have a book that's more interactive than an entire conference devoted to interactivity in the coolest town in the world, Austin? There's something wrong with the way we think about what interactivity is and how that percolates into the kinds of relationships we have with each other in a presentational environment, in a business environment, in a public communication environment. And my job here is to try to take that apart for you and help you find a way through. So this is actually what happens in the book. And you got to choose, and then you roll your dice, and you find out what's going on. But I find this inherently more interesting than everything you just saw in my little sad techno music presentation of South by Southwest PowerPoints that I harvested from SlideShare. Having a simple choice. So I've been teaching public speaking for 25 years. You can tell because I'm giving you all early 80s cultural references. And I present in venues like this, and I will tell you that things have changed. I've been presenting like this for quite a while now. And in the last 3 years, I don't have an event that invites me or a place I apply to that doesn't ask me to do as little slides as possible. All people want is discussion, participation, connection. They want as little as you can do in the front of the room. Students, though, when you stand in front of them and say, "What do you think?" or group work, they go, why? Because as a student, you're afraid everyone's a fraud. And if I come at you with group work, that means I didn't prepare for class that day. Woo, professor live. Whereas as an adult, you already know everyone's a fraud. You no longer expect that anybody could stand up and perform their non-fraudulence to you. So you don't care whether or not they are going to present for you a slide deck full of 75 slides and take you through a bunch of bullet points because you know it doesn't matter anyway. But we're stuck somehow between that part of us that's a student and is like, prove to me you know what you're talking about, and the part of us that's like, but if I prove to you I know what I'm talking about, you're going to start sleeping because there's no place for you in that story. And so somewhere in that moment of being a kid and being an adult, even those of us who are of advanced age can't necessarily get by as well as we want. They're a professional speaker, it happens. So my book, The Zombie Guide to Public Speaking, was all about how everything's kind of a fraud, how mostly we shamble around brainless, looking for brains, like doing things repetitively, like the zombies that go to the mall just because they remember it. And you are here, zombies, and I'm up here, and we look at bullet points, and we use the laser pointer, and we just go through the whole day, and we're like, what happened to my life? That it's all kind of a fraud. And students love that because if you tell students, hey, you think how everything's a fraud because you're 18 and you're super hardcore, yeah, it is a fraud, it's fine. And they're excited by that. But you are not excited by that because like I said, you already know that. So I want a different metaphor than the zombies, and that's why we're looking at adventures. We're going to try to fix this in 40 minutes. We can't, right? Because we need a new way of thinking about what it is that you're doing up here and how you manage all those pieces. Because we live in a super interactive society. It's been 45 years since they invented Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm right now teaching an online class on Dungeons and Dragons, just in case you wanted to make sure I wasn't a fraud. And if you go back long enough, you could find the history of the last 45 years is really an awful lot about very, very similar things. If you look at the invention of the internet, everything happening right at the beginning of the 70s and just accelerating over time. All these ways that we interact with each other, it's no longer top-down communication, it's multi-way communication. How we play games has changed. Video games. Most of you probably spend more time video gaming than you do passively watching television, and if you are watching television, you're tweeting about it. Like with Leslie Jones on the Oscars or something like that. You're connected with it in a different way. The idea of passive reception is just ridiculous. You can't even manage it. I wouldn't want to do it. You have Tumblr and fan fiction and all this other stuff where you can connect with what's going on, share your opinions about everything. It's the Yelpization of the world. Everything needs your opinion. Every experience needs you to log that experience and talk about it and connect with it. Your life is spent with your phone doing things and swiping things and interacting with things. And then we come to a room like this, and it feels like it should be different. We even tell our myths differently. You know, we don't have, I guess we still have Thor, and he's all old, but we have Spider-Man, and he's like a kid from Queens, right? And our heroes are even more accessible, more like us. You could be Spider-Man, and if you watch Into the Spider-Verse, you probably are Spider-Man. Leadership theory, right? Revolutionizes itself and talks about participatory leadership and shared connection as opposed to the old top-down model. So all this is happening at the exact same time that Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games and the idea of a participatory story is invented in the 1970s. So we've been living with 45 years of accelerating interactivity, and it's our job to find a way to take that from its birth and its awkward tween years, which is kind of like Tamagotchis, and and moving on to sort of angry YA sort of levels of things where we interact. We're in a world where you can write fan fiction, it becomes a bestseller. So our job is to figure out where we are now, and what does this mean? And what I think is happening is we're in a place in where interactivity has become professionalized, apparently everywhere except South by Southwest Interactive. And it's our job to find a way to make those connections and to take a moment like this, where I've been talking about interactivity without letting you talk for 10 minutes now, and figure out a way to change it. So my metaphor that I want to use is this idea of the adventure. So what is an adventure? An adventure is a story, so it's a narrative, but it's not a closed-ended narrative. It's a narrative where you are interacting with it and you make meaningful choices. When was the last time you sat in a seat like this and made a meaningful choice? Not like your DoorDash order. What are your choices usually? Like seeing if the slide deck has been downloaded up to like some shared drive so that you could download it and then never use it. Slide decks like mine are super annoying because there's no bullet points. If you were sleeping, you can't go back and be like, what was that again? There's a picture of like a dragon later. I don't even know what's happening. Or you could do the classic, like the religious moment of business development, where you pick up your phone and you take a picture of the slide. It's like the old lighter and now cell phone at the concert. Like Kanye's up there, and you're like, and what are you going to do with that? Nothing. But everybody else did it, and if you're not the only one who's the Spirit moves them to take, what does that mean about your listening skills? So our job is to say, what do we do about this? How do we fix this and make interactivity a little bit more interactive? And I think for those of you who came here and are like, oh, it's a presentation speaking, it's about public speaking, it's about connecting, we're going to talk about delivery, and we're not going to talk about that stuff. We're going to talk about the foundational way in which you see your relationship with the people who are in the room with you, and how you find the answer to that dilemma of how do you connect with them in a different way. When you find that answer, everything else falls into place a little bit easier. If it doesn't, we end up with this. Like I said, I've been doing this for a while, and my students text me bad things that are happening to them in their work lives. So many pictures of bad PowerPoints with sad, sleepy heads in front of them. I edited one for language, students, what are you going to do? Young professionals are notoriously foul-mouthed, I've found, turns out. Maybe not you guys. You guys look like you're nicer than that. I don't know. But normally, this is what we're seeing. So how do we fix this? How do we move on? All right, let's fix it. Let's talk about narrative. Let's talk about how to build that story and how to connect, and then we'll talk about how to share it with others as we go through. And that's really our time today as we move forward. So let's talk about a story. How do you tell a story? Someone use your microphone and tell me the story in 20-second version. That's the scary part, right? Because if you go on for like 30 minutes, then my time is up, and we're like, I want a 20-second version of the best breakfast you ever had. All right, hit it.
All right, went to Seattle, paid too much for a hotel room, and paid way too much for a breakfast delivered to our room, and it was incredibly nice. With my wife.
Okay, so that turned a different way than I thought. Somebody else give me their best breakfast. No one wants to compete? Hit it.
Yeah. Oh, wow, sorry. Yeah, the best breakfast I ever had was probably a couple weeks ago. I woke up and cooked myself pancakes, and the fact that I made them myself was why it was the best breakfast.
Okay, all right. I like how they both have inspirational messages attached to the breakfast content, which is really cool. I like that. Give me one more. Somebody else give me your breakfast. Hit it.
Okay, so this was like a couple weeks ago, and I stopped on the side of the road on my way back from like a family vacation, and I was actually looking for something entirely different, but this place had a bunch of cars outside, so I was like, oh, it has to be good. There's a bunch of people here. So I went in and I ate soft shell crab eggs Benedict. It was the best thing I've ever had.
All right, cool. Very good. So tell me, does it feel awesome to like grab one of those mics and like light it up and talk? I mean, I don't know. If you haven't tried it yet, you gotta give it a go. So, okay, so stories about breakfast are not inherently the most dramatic things in the world, right? But those were kind of cool. And there's a part of you that, like, think about where your head's at right now in terms of this presentation, in terms of what's going on. Would you rather I get to the next part of the PowerPoint, or would you rather hear a couple more breakfast stories? And I bet you that there's a wide range. There's probably like a whole curve of different opinions about that. You know, you're like, well, I don't know, I could hear another breakfast, maybe. I'm getting kind of hungry, in fact, so it might give me some ideas. And some of you are like, no, I need some bullet points. What would help me right now is some bullet points so that I feel like I was not at sea. I need to feel like someone is directing my life for me. I have too many choices, and I go to work so that my choices can be stripped from me, and my agency can be compressed into a small person-sized homunculus that wanders around the hall, you know. No, so I don't know about that. But so those are pretty good stories, and what I like about those stories is they had what stories are supposed to have, which is a beginning, middle, and an end, right? Each of them, I didn't expect to be there, we spent too much, you know, I made it myself, and they sort of have these pieces. So we're talking about how to make stories right now. Some of you are like, wow, I already know this. Okay, so we'll go through it quickly. So there's all sorts of ways you can build stories. In high school, you learned this. You probably learned it as the Aristotelian plot model. It's Freytag's pyramid. It's super boring. It's all about, but, you know, maybe there's rising action and falling action in there. Okay, fine. And there's all sorts of models. Like if you watch Star Wars, you're grabbing Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, which is all circular and male-dominated. And if you watch princess movies or grew up with those and now feel sort of super weird about your princess fetish because you watched Ralph Breaks the Internet and feel guilty about your childhood now, you know, and this is a Vladimir Prop's Morphology of the Russian Folktale, which is the 31-part story that's usually about how the princess sort of saves things. And so here's a couple models for story. And then the one you're most familiar with, even though you don't know, is Sid Field's model of how to write a screenplay, which dominates every movie you've ever seen. And that's sort of like how you come to understand stories. So we could talk a lot about how to build a story from this way. But instead, you know, I feel like we got all this from your breakfast stories. And it was faster and less boring, and there weren't 31 points. So it comes down to trusting your audience. Like, I didn't know what kind of story you were going to tell. I mean, I wandered around ahead of time, you know, to see who was, you know, whatever. But even so, I mostly was just picking people who were at random, people who said that they wanted to share their story. Every time when I ask you to share a breakfast story, it tells me exactly what I want to know. Like, I've never gone wrong with the breakfast, like ever. And I do this a lot. And part of it is trust. You know, you want your audience to trust you to bring them knowledge, data, ideas, you know, directions for the future, depending on how important your presentation is. But we don't trust the audience to have a part to play in that. Even on something as simple as how do you tell a story? It's all we do all day is consume stories. That's the nature of entertainment. So if I can't trust you guys to tell me a story, then I don't know who you are. And you probably don't have anything to learn from me. So it's about connecting up those stories in a different way. But let's break it back down for a second. Right here, in most stories, we get suspense. This is the graphic from the old radio show, which was awesome. Before my time, but I used to listen to them with my grandpa when we go camping. And we listened to creepy stories about murderers, which is fantastic for sleeping in a tent. I had my fighting fantasy books, though, and would roll dice with them, and it was all fine. Right around there, we have suspense. We don't know what's going to happen next. Even if the genre is like A Dark and Stormy Night, we kind of know what's going to happen next. If you're watching Marvel movies, you kind of know what's going to happen next. If you're watching a DC movie, you kind of know what's going to happen next, just lower quality than the Marvel movies. You know, you just sort of go on. I mean, you know how stories work. There's this part where you're not sure what's going to happen. And Alfred Hitchcock says this is not, I don't know what's going to happen, because honestly, seriously, you know how all movies are going to end. You know, if it's a Nicholas Sparks novel, you know, it has like two white people almost kissing on the cover, you know they're going to kiss later. You know, like there's only so many endings. You know every story. So what is suspense? If suspense is I don't know where it's going to go, but you already know everything, really, kind of, if you thought about it. What does that mean? Hitchcock says it's an ethical dilemma where you kind of want something bad to happen to characters you like, because otherwise the story's boring, but then you feel bad about wanting something awful to happen to Frodo. You know, because you're like, but if it was easy to just like schlep the ring over to Mordor, you'd be like, who cares, right? I mean, this is no fun. Like, this is the worst story ever. I'd rather listen about breakfast because at least it made me hungry, you know? And so you kind of both want it to be over and want it to keep going, and that's really where you're at in a story, is that moment where you're invested in the answers. And when it goes well, you feel like this, right? What's going on? When was the last time you felt like that in a presentation? Like, right now, I have no idea where we're going to go, you know? And isn't that kind of cool? It requires that you trust that I'm going to get you to the end. And you might be like, well, I don't know this guy. He's got a bow tie. I mean, what's the chances that we're actually going to resolve this in a way that's meaningful to all of us? You know, so you're not sure, right? But I mean, it requires trust in both ways, and that's where we're less stuck with suspense, because you don't know. Hopefully, if it's an internal piece of communication, you know each other, you know what you have to say, and you can trust each other more, and it works. But in some cases, though, this is not what we want. Ideally, when you're getting to the moment where you're not sure how it's all going to pull together in a presentation or in a story, you feel like you love the journey, not that you're lost. So how do we pull ourselves together and focus on how to get ourselves moving and not be lost, but still have mystery? And the clue is this sort of word, narrative. We'll move on. Instead of this, at the top is the Gettysburg Address in PowerPoint format. You know, the lost slides from Abe Lincoln all those years ago. And then at the bottom is what most slides look like. Now, you could put a background on it, you know, like that one with the ink spatters and the parchment. No one's ever seen that before or used it before. You know, or the one with like the red arrowy swoosh thing. No, you're serious. You better do the blue swoosh. You know, because professionals don't use the red swoosh. You know, and so you have all these sort of places in which instead of letting us have some suspense, you instead give us a continual stream of information that never allows our brain to move anywhere else. Well, it does, just not the way you want. And so most of the time, this is what it feels like, as the slides slowly crush your soul, and you have no ability to connect with what's going on. And you wait. I mean, you're not just like sitting there bored, you are, but you do something else. You're thinking about something else. You move on elsewhere, and there's no way to find yourself in, so you just keep going, and you're like, it'll be fine, there'll be an email later. They always email the slides, so I don't even have to be here. I'll just look and go to slide 37, which is what I want, and I'm going to think about lunch. So this word narrative, when you saw it, you didn't necessarily know what was going to happen as a result of it, but you had a feeling that we're going to talk about something called narrative, and when he's done talking about something called narrative, he's going to talk about the next thing, which you might remember is called interactive, exclamation point. That's in between being lost and crushed. In other words, as we build presentations, we often think of presentations from a PowerPoint architecture format. Did you know that PowerPoint was invented to replicate the pages of a book? That's why there are headers. There are not titles and headers on PowerPoint slides because that was determined with user testing to be the most efficient way to display information and to keep audience members from getting lost. It was made because when you read a book, at the top it says Chapter 2. That's how PowerPoint was invented. That's why it looks like it does. There's no reason for it to look like it does. And there's no reason to build your slides in such a way that it looks like that, except if your audience demands it of you. Instead, we could do something different. So how would you help us navigate your experience with trust? I tend to call these magic feathers. Like if you played Mario video games or Link, you know, you played some Zelda, whatever you did. You always got items that you didn't know how to use yet, and you had to learn how to use them later. But you had them, so it anchored your adventure. In this case, what is this presentation on? This is a presentation I deliver a lot. This is a presentation on how Facebook ruins our lives. How Facebook is a chess hustler in the park, lets you win a little bit and then doesn't. And ultimately, all of your strategies that you learned from Guy Kawasaki in 2009 don't work, and you're eventually going to have to buy ads. And you can see Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, looking super, super depressed at being the best. It's hard to be the best. So I'm taking them on a chess-related journey. And you're like, well, what does that have to do? Well, it does. Harry Potter journey, comic book journey, and we take us through pieces. So there are all sorts of ways in which you can stack things together in a presentational format that allow your audience to have that moment where they're not sure what's going to happen next and think about how they might orient themselves towards it while you pull them back in. And the reason to structure it in this way is we haven't even got to the interactive part. But if you don't have that moment where people feel like they can think, where they can take a risk and they're not sure that you are going to make it all clear to them, then they know it's up to them to engage the material in a different way. That motivation is normally lost to us. So when you take all these things together, you end up with suspense. I got rid of Wolverine there because he's too scary. No Wolverine. And that suspense is great, and it's powerful and useful. But we're not used to it. Some of you have that kind of like uncomfortable sort of look, like, I don't think this will work. I don't think I can do this. I don't think anybody will let me do this. I think it's bad. Audiences, though, are more resilient than you think. You are more resilient than you think you are. This is Scenes of Austin. These are people waiting in line. People love to wait in line in Austin. How many of you have waited in line in Austin? Now, here's the big kicker. So keep those hands up high. Keep your hand up if you waited in line and you did not know what was at the end of the line, but you just decided to wait anyway. You guys are really straight-laced, except for you. Yours kind of like... Normally, half the hands stay up. People in Austin love to wait in line because they're waiting in line. And I'll talk to people, and they're like, it's better that way. Like, I'll just come upon a line and get in it. Like, I don't know what's at the end. Could be a burger, could be a concert. I don't know. Isn't that cool? Or when you're scrolling through Instagram angrily, looking at all your friends whose lives are cohering better than yours. You don't know what's next, and you have a hint that it's going to make you mad. But we live our lives in this sea of uncertainty that we use as entertainment. We love it. We want to take selfies of ourselves in line and post them to your Instagram, so as you're moving through things you don't know, you're like, oh, look, he's in line again. And does he ever get anywhere? I don't know if he ever gets anywhere. So people are more resilient to these messages. Let's talk about how to craft them. And none of what I'm saying to you is super alien from the last 50, 60 years of thought on presentations. In this case, sales. Let's say you're doing external communication. What is it about? It's about relationships, you know. Look at Kurt Russell's used cars sport coat there. You know, how can you not want to have a meaningful, trusting relationship with that sport coat? Or the steak and the sizzle, Elmer Wheeler in 1957. You don't sell the steak, you sell the sizzle. The sizzle requires trust and suspense. So does selling a car to somebody. In any sort of external environment, your job is to cultivate that relationship, to be able to enable them to feel trust in you and your advice and your item, your service, whatever it is that you're connecting with. And how do you do that if your presentation is such a Berlin Wall of content that doesn't let anyone in? Internally, think of the last presentation you gave to a working group or a team or a larger group. Are you sure it wouldn't have been better to give everybody a one-page handout and skip the speech and just sat and say, okay, so let's talk about this? Wouldn't that be more efficient every time? Yeah, of course, the reason why we don't is because people don't read their email. It's like why we lecture in college, because people don't read the book. You probably didn't read the book. Most people don't read the book. You know, so we don't trust people to read their emails and come and have a conversation about things. And so it's a question of trust and culture and issues like that. But in general, I like to think of this when I'm presenting. Like, what would be better than if I just stopped talking, gave you a page of notes to walk away with, and we're done? Wouldn't that be better? So when we're presenting internally, our job is to be able to figure out how to help people work with the information they need with the data that they're supposed to be studying, right? And come to conclusions that are helpful in a way that doesn't feel like it was a waste. So in most professional environments, these are welcome, but we don't do them because we're afraid of them, because of this part, interactivity. Choices. Choices make us nervous. Choices make it hard for us to figure out how to do things. And of course, interactivity, as a history, you're probably watching Stranger Things. Come on. You start with Dungeons and Dragons and paper and nerds around a table. You move on to nerds and a computer and multi-user dungeons and IRC chat that my friend Danielle was so obsessed with, she graduated an entire semester later in the early 90s. And you move on to World of Warcraft and all the gaming that you do all the time. So we live in a world where we want interactivity. We want to be able to do these things. The entire internet, the entire Web 2.0 is devoted to you having adventures with your ideas, with your breakfast, with your car, with wherever you are, you have an opinion, and you log your location, and you have a review, and you have an adventure, and you earn points, and you get rewards, and you get magic swords so that you can fight the demons later on when you get to level 9. And your life has become gamified into this interactive space. So here you are. You are Will the Wise from Stranger Things, hoping your friends will still play D&D even though they've discovered girls in the 3rd season. Spoiler alert. And how do you get them to play? You have all these characters surrounding you. You have all these people with you, and you want to get them to play. And this is the dilemma of a speaker preparing a presentation. Not what should I do? What should my first slide be? What should my background be? The question is, you want to take these people on an adventure and get their brains moving in the way you want and have them leave energized, thoughtful, and connected. And how do you do that? In the words of Gary Gygax, the inventor of Dungeons and Dragons, what do you do? So I'm interested in what you would do. We don't have an enormous amount of time before you get to escape to lunch. But what I'd like to do is, in the groups at the tables you are, take a minute and think about the places in which you might be in a space to present. Maybe you're not, in your current role, a kind of person who's presenting to other groups, but imagine where that would be in a year or 2 or 6 months or 3 days. What would that look like? How would you present what you have to share in such a way that would invite people in the room to participate? Take a second. Talk to each other. How you guys doing? Heavy skepticism? No, I'm just... See, I told you not to get your hopes up. It's great. It's terrible. It's terrible.
You're doing a great job.
Don't you love a speaker who's soliciting positive feedback in the middle of the presentation? You know, you ready? No.
Positive feedback.
Yeah, hey, it's good. If you're like most groups, keep talking, it's okay. You were only partially listening before, why should that change? If you're like most groups, when this starts, you're like, I was barely listening. Or B, I think this is crap and we should just do 70-point slides full of bullets. I don't believe any of this, arg, right? But there's one person in the group who's like, no, we could do this. So all of you have a Hermione in the group, maybe. And many of you are probably like, I buy this in the abstract, but when I think about the people who I present to all the time, if I did this, they would lose it. I had a student once who tried this. She'd always, and I'm going to get your thoughts here. She tried this when she went out into the big world, young professional internship. She was presenting to somebody fairly high up in the organization. And she did what I usually suggest to students, which is at a certain point, have just a black slide. Oh, that's me. We don't want that. I got a black slide later. Because when you make the slide black, all the faces just turn to you, and it's like, what's happening? It's a moment that's really cool. It's like just tiny, if you take nothing else, just have some blank slides where everything goes away and people can connect with you and talk and aren't sure what's going on next. Oh my gosh, they have freedom for a second. So she did it, and he's like, what's wrong? She's like, no, that's our own purpose. He's like, why? It's like, well, so that everyone would look over at me for a second. He's like, well, I was enjoying not looking at you. And that's really happened. And you think, wow, that's such a strange conversation to be having. Like, really, that's where we're at? Like, I was choosing to depersonalize you as a younger employee and to harvest data and intelligence from you without connecting with you at a meaningful level personally. That's the corporate culture we're working for in this environment. It's what we stand for, and it's what we wish to continue, right? There's all sorts of ways in which you could do things. So you started. Let me let you finish now that I've interrupted your process. Why? Because I'm interacting in your process and you don't like it. Take one more minute and sort of somebody see if, like, could we share something? Is there a way that you could sort of push the way you interact in these contexts where you are that would work? And if your answer is nope, that's okay. We can hear that too. It's cool. I can take it. I got a bow tie. I can manage negative feedback. We can do it. All right, so take one more minute. All right, who's got something? Oh, now it gets quiet. Share with the group? No, we're not doing that. All right, hit it. Use the mic.
So we were saying you just try to totally get rid of all bullet points in general, try to have the whole PowerPoint slide presentation with just visuals. And so even if you want to get them that bullet point information, you can make them work through it and kind of guide them to it through whatever visuals you decide to use. So you're not just spoon feeding them, you kind of got to make them work and interact a bit more.
Okay, cool. Other stuff? Yes.
Okay. So what we were speaking is that perhaps in the office, in this environment, a way to start being interactive is by beginning your presentation by asking questions to your team, like, what are the issues that you still haven't found a solution for on your day-to-day activities? And just ask that key question that guides towards your answer, because when you're presenting, usually in this environment, you're going to give solutions. So just push the question, and that's how you start being interactive. And as they mentioned, yes, the presentation is important because they respect the bullet points. But I guess that just making this presentation not only an exposition, but a conversation. And that's what it's expected here, because you're a team.
Okay, and the theme I hear from both of those is pretty clear, is you need the team in the room to do something, right? They need to accomplish something as a result of this, and your presentation is just a piece of a larger effort that has results at the end. And we have to find a way to empower those teams.
So we have some actual interactive tools that you could use instead of PowerPoint, and you can actually embed them in a PowerPoint presentation if you feel like that would make people more comfortable.
Sure.
Analytics tools that allow you to take wherever the conversation goes, you can drill into the data and really create the story as you go along.
Sure, yeah, like if you're using like the story form in Tableau or something like that, where you're able to sort of move through the data in that moment, it's so much better than sort of like summarizing it out. So that's one piece of it. And then there are other sort of forms outside the data sort of field where you can sort of like have live polling and interactivity and other kinds of stuff. So there's a variety of technical solutions to this that are interesting, and I like that idea.
I was going to bring it because.
Sorry, I just spoke over you.
We are using some of those in
in the IT space with our agile transformation, those tools and word cloud. So you're getting feedback, but you're also allowing anonymity so that people feel a little less under the gun and concerned about speaking.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say is we have distributed across the world, and getting that interactivity when you're dealing with distributed people is really, really tough, because let's face it, we all multitask.
Yeah.
One of the things we've been using is really pushing that people actually turn their camera on. So they're video instead of audio only, and that helps with the interaction and engagement.
Very good. I once knew a person, go for it. I'll finish my story later.
I'm working on a project around inspiration and the concept of it and what it means here at Alcon. And a lot of my work has been through discovery conversations with people. And I have found that not only asking questions that they have to respond to is important, but asking follow-up questions that really makes them think and engage their mind in a deeper way has really helped to kind of create that engagement.
Okay. A few ideas.
We had more of a question. So
Yeah.
we all work in finance, and a lot of our job is to like put the data out there, and you might be presenting to a group, and then they're like, oh, this is great, and they want to send it to a higher level who you're not going to get in a meeting with. So bridging that gap between having that narrative and still portraying all the information to someone you're never going to get the chance to have that narrative with, most likely, was kind of our space that we're curious
So how does
about.
that information follow after you in that situation?
Exactly, like how it would like pass on. They're like, oh, this was great, this meeting was super powerful and impactful, and you had all this narrative, and then they're like, say they wanted to pass it up to the CFO.
Right.
It's not going to be the same meeting, and bridging that gap, that's where we're at.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about is what Gar Reynolds has talked about as what he calls a slideument, which is what we do with slide decks, which is that it has three purposes and it doesn't serve any of them well. One is your outline to keep you on track as a speaker, and that should be separate from what's behind you, so that you're not inflicting that on everyone else. There's what I should be seeing in the moment to help me understand what's going on, and third, there's the takeaway later. And oftentimes we just like give out slide decks or something as if that's enough of a takeaway in those situations. And so we build our PowerPoint for that purpose afterwards, and I can't think of a less useful way of packaging information for decision making than a PowerPoint slide. But we do that because it's easier, because we think that we're supposed to, something like that. But if instead you can give people a live data file and they can work with it, then, or you can give them a report that guides and the file that guides them through it, I would say something like that. If the job is you don't have access at that point and somebody has to make decisions as a result of it, what would they need to make those decisions and to understand where you're coming from? I would think that you would produce something else as a result of it, but we often think, the presentation is going to be enough to go forward with. I once had a presenter who, they had a live polling thing, the polling question that was constantly open was, how's the presentation going? And they had an assistant who had this sort of live numbers. And it would just start to but it was really interesting. It was super scary. You don't put it up because people game that system. They'll be like, this is a 0% presentation. I hate all of it. But they'd have somebody there and they would be able to wave through it a little bit, and then they worked on it. And then the next time they spoke to that, this was the teacher, the next time they spoke to that classroom, it was like, what was happening in those moments where everybody was getting us negatives, and how could we build it in a different way next time? There's all sorts of ways to do this kind of stuff. And what I'm hearing is you're already there. You're already working on all this stuff. You don't really need me to tell you to do it. My job here really is to sort of give you the kind of conceptual architecture over the top of it, to think about what you're doing as the most important part of what it is you do when you're sharing information. It's not the thing that you do to ask questions at the end necessarily. It's something that you do to put them at the beginning, to make the answers meaningful, which is different than often. So this is me presenting on social media. And so now we do keynotes where I sit there with my phone, and everyone sits there with their phone, and my phone gets duplicated on the screen, and we analyze marketing concepts, and we look at actual things in practice and look at them all together and have a discussion. And that's what people want. But it feels like we don't always want that inside different kinds of places, but it sounds like that's not the organization you are, and that's good. That's what we're after. So moving on, though, we've talked about interactivity, and I heard some interesting pieces. And we talked about tools, whether technical tools or verbal tools like question asking, things like that. I want to just take the last minute or so to pull in this question of making those choices meaningful. So this is that question, of what do you do? A meaningful choice. How do I know that the answer to my question is actually going to be a part of the decision-making structure? How do I know that the way that we're working through the sort of slicer data in Power BI or something like that actually is a part of the way that those decisions are going to get made after we all leave this room and stop talking about it together? It's easy to create spaces for interactivity. It's harder to sort of get people to trust that their input into those interactive moments is going to be relevant, captured, propel us forward. Isn't just like the Q&A at the end where people come up and say this and you're like, I'll get to that. We'll do that later. We'll do that next time. And so the final piece of this really is about that, and I don't have that answer for you. But I think the most important part of the idea of the adventure is that you make meaningful choices. In the game world, what a meaningful choice means is I'm not just rolling dice. I used to play Dungeons & Dragons in 7th grade on the bus on the way to chess tournaments. I realize I'm outing myself fairly heavily as a massive nerd. Our dungeon master did not have dice. We had to trust that he was rolling virtual dice in his brain for us. So we do things like the orc, you swing at the orc, and he'd go like, you missed. This is non-meaningful choices, right? It's like I feel kind of like I always die on the bus D&D, and I don't know that I trust that your dice rolling in your head is fair. In most games like Candyland, there's non-meaningful choices. It doesn't matter what you do, the game ends up the same. And sometimes people's entire careers feel like that. It doesn't matter what I do, the outcome will end up the same. And our job is to be able to sort of have these moments where we're together be places where your contribution can have meaning in a different way, can give them something more. Now, I've eclipsed huge amounts of our time. It's going to offer you to talk about any other piece of public speaking that you're interested in. But we don't have those moments. But I will point out that in spite of the sort of linear nature of PowerPoint, I have 250 other slides at the end of this in case our timing had worked out differently and you wanted a little bit more on how to do argument or how to break apart graphs into pieces. I have the guy in the back, and I was going to shout out slide numbers, and we would go there so that everything could be about what you wanted. But timing didn't work out quite so specifically in that particular way. So let me wrap up because I've got like literally 90 seconds. When we think about your experience as an employee or as a person in the world who has ideas, this is our dungeon as we get to the end. We get to yes, and there's all sorts of challenges and rewards along the way. And our leadership theory, as in the very beginning of the presentation, has developed to assume that I don't have to tell you what to do. I can simply guide you along the way. And as I do that, you level up, you get better, you get promoted, you learn new things, you eventually become your own dungeon master of a working group, and then you're like, what do I do? And I help you as your leader by giving you potions to heal you when things are bad, to give you extra strength potions when you need them. And the idea is that leadership has sort of incorporated this very specific adventure model of enabling people to take their own steps as they go forward. And in the end, I think what our job should be is to think about presentations as a piece of leadership, not as a piece of communication. And that's, I think, the secret to pulling those choices and making them meaningful, so that this ancient picture of a presentation with this sleeping guy who needs an espresso, this is probably not you, but how do we get that guy to the end? If our presentations are one-directional and that presentation moment is so separate from the rest of work life, how do we find our way to the end normally? In a world of interactivity, I think we can expect more out of all of these things. All right. So I'm going to finish up with that. And I would encourage you to think about, from your perspective, in your region of this place, in your goals, in what you do, the teams you work with, the people you speak to internally and externally, how you can think about communication as a piece of leadership and not as a piece of information. It's not about persuasion. It's not about details. It's about something larger. And what would that mean for you to take leadership and build on it in a different kind of way? How do you enable people to make meaningful choices, to interact with your ideas, and to share your narrative moving forward? And what would that mean for you? And it's nice at the end to have the speaker wrap it up in some perfect little story that you can take with a bow and sort of remember, here's my story at the end. But in the end, whatever I said now wouldn't be enough. And I want to leave it more open to you to think about that going forward. And if that feels like, all I can do is say that frustration is important. The reason why I interrupted you when you were doing small group work is that you would get annoyed with the interruption and recommit yourself to small group work in a way that you weren't before the interruption. Sometimes that frustration, sometimes that suspense is important. And so I want to leave you with that, to start your own adventures, to think about trusting your audience through the frustrations involved in this kind of communication and seeing what you can get as a result. Thank you, everyone.